We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
All right, it is Friday, October 20th, 2023, and I think everyone knows what we're going to be discussing here. It's been 13 days since the events that took place on October 7th in Israel, and we've had some time, Jeremy, to take a look at what's going on and have a chance to talk about this among ourselves and take a look at some trends and at the landscape. And we're going to be looking at this through, our unique, particular, deep political oriented focus on this as far as the event itself and things that have been going on since. And you've got a term for this event that took place on October 7th.
Yes, because it happened during a Jewish holiday called Simchat Torah. I have titled this not Israel's 9/11, the Simchat Torah Treason Terror War. Or we could add a plot at the end if we were talking about the internal dynamics of Crime Minister Netanyahu's regime's involvement in this at many different scales. And so we'll get into all of that. But I just want to point out that if we were to think about this moment analogically in terms of 9/11 classic TM, because everybody's calling this Israel's 9/11. It's being used as a shorthand for the proportional amount of deaths, but it's also the quote-unquote response to it is being justified in a callback to the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And there are lots of things that are very similar. It's not exactly the same. There are some very dissimilar aspects too. But in general, I think it's very important for us to understand where we are in a historical moment, that in a way we are still within September of 2001, less than 2 weeks out from the original 9/11 in terms of Israel's 9/11. Now, obviously, I've been calling it, this is like 9/11 on amphetamines, combined with steroids, and the geopolitics of this are so obviously massive. The immediate quote-unquote response is so violent and destructive to civilian lives in Gaza. And the scale of the originating attack is very major in terms of the Israeli consciousness. And so I think it's important for us to understand our moment in time right now in terms of what kinds of focal points and analyses might be or might have been, let's say, really important in the 2 weeks after September 11th, 2001, and then amplify that in terms of our understanding of the moment. Because not only are we dealing with this really, genocidal push into bombing Gaza that we're seeing from the Crime Minister's regime and the Israeli military, but surrounding that obviously is the question of, what some people are saying, the beginning of World War III in that way. But there's also the very specific regional and international dynamics in terms of this that are very different from 9/11 just because of the difference in geography. The United States is always recognized as being very separated geographically from our potential nemeses. That was why the Cuban Missile Crisis was such a big deal and made into such a big deal, and was actually, in terms of nuclear conflagration, was a very big deal because of how close the threat was to what we now call, in a post 9/11 world, the homeland, right? So in this case, you have the international dynamics of Hezbollah on the north side in terms of Israel. You have this Hamas in terms of Gaza. You have the West Bank dynamics in terms of the Palestinian Authority and the connection with the Jordanians. You have the Syrian connection. There's already been Israeli bombing in Syria. You now have the U.S. with two fleets, basically two aircraft carriers there parked off the coast. It looks like there was already even a potential shoot down of an incoming missile and incoming drones that seem to have been launched from Yemen, maybe. And so those are some of the really big dynamics, and that's not even touching on the domestic political aspects that we're looking at right now, which are very intense, understandably, in terms of the desire to stop this escalating set of atrocities against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, just recently, we found out that the family members of, I believe, a former Congressman, Justin Amash, have been killed. And so this is like something that we've never really seen before. And I'll point out that the whole question of Israel-Palestine, and specifically what some people call the Palestinian question, are back on the table. And so maybe we could just start by talking about, let's back away from analogies to 9/11 in terms of who all did it and why, to a place of the surface level geopolitical context from what we might call the official Israel 9/11 story of a security breakdown, an intelligence failure that allowed a major Hamas organized attack on mainly kibbutzes and a rave in southern Israel, very close to the Gaza Strip there. And I'll just point out that there is so much escalation even now, right, of people talking about none of this would have happened if Trump had been president or something like that. Same kind of thing that was being said around the Ukraine war. And at the very same time, a very interesting timing that an interview, a long form podcast interview between Lex Friedman and Jared Kushner was just released. And in fact, they recorded it just days before the Simchat Torah treason terror war plot was even came to fruition. And so they actually had to go back and record a new piece to put in the front of it to then address this issue. So it looks like Kushner came back into Lex Friedman's studio and seemed to actually, Kushner seemed to echo this line of that this is just a marker of this wouldn't have happened under strong President Trump. And there was a lot there in terms of the explanations that Kushner gave in terms of his role in the Abraham Accords and then his quote unquote Palestinian peace plan. So I'd actually like to start there. That to me, the prima facie scenario here geopolitically that would help make coherent the Palestinian and or Hamas impetus for this attack is, first of all, it was titled Al-Aqsa Flood. So it's at the very least, it's being framed as related to the struggle in Jerusalem. And we pointed out that Netanyahu has an MO that he uses that's now really escalated with his new, very fascist, Judeo-supremacist new regime that includes Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And Ben Gvir was a character on the ground the last time that Netanyahu got into this quote unquote conflict with Hamas. And that was stimulated via the actions on the ground of basically incitement by the Ben Gvir crew. And then Hamas is said to have retaliated for that. And then Netanyahu goes to bombing or mowing the lawn, as they call it. And so this is obviously way beyond that, because we've gone way beyond intent of quote unquote mowing the lawn to something like what looks like to be stated the dehumanizing intent that precedes things like mass slaughter, terms like ethnic cleansing and or then genocide. We've seen it from the highest level of officials in the Israeli government, even the nice soft Israeli president Herzog got into the mix in terms of, I think he basically said that there was actually no innocent civilians in Gaza, that kind of thing. The head of the military, like the Israeli Secretary of Defense, Gallant, seemed to direct this term human animals to all of the Palestinians in Gaza.
Naftali Bennett had almost a borderline kind of meltdown when a British reporter asked him about civilians.
Yes, he did. And just because you brought up Bennett, before we get back to this question of Hamas and Netanyahu, I just want to say that my understanding right now is that it is very likely that we are seeing some kind of terror cell, and very likely a traitorous terror cell within the highest levels of Israeli officialdom, in terms of I've now identified 4 separate Sayeret Matkal Israeli Special Forces veterans who seem to be at the core of the mix of this Israel's 9/11 Simchat Torah terror treason war. And that includes the roles that we saw people like Ehud Barak and Netanyahu play after 9/11, which was Barak mainly in the media, articulating what the American response was going to be to 9/11, that it was going to be the launching of a global war on terror that is very much in line with the decades-long architecture of Netanyahu's Jerusalem conference and his book on winning the terror war, or whatever it is, winning against terrorism or something like that. And Netanyahu then really did some deep Sayeret Matkal operations behind what he must see as enemy lines in the U.S. Congress, making a major case for the Iraq War, which we now know is a part of the Clean Break White Paper War in fall of 2002. And a reminder that both of them are the Sayeret Matkal Special Forces veterans. And Ehud Barak was a commander over Netanyahu when Netanyahu came up. All right. You know who else is Sayeret Matkal veteran? Naftali Bennett. And Bennett, as you pointed out, is in the media mix intensely and really getting like hysterical about being asked about civilian lives. He seemed to try to browbeat a black British media correspondent who was hosting him on his program. And then I will mention one final, maybe a quadrangle of potential Simchat Torah, treason, terror war cell that we might be seeing here is a man named Herzl. Interesting. Herzl, like the father of political Zionism, maybe. Herzl Halevi, who is the chief of the general staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, because it has just come out from an Israeli reporter that there was an Israeli security meeting the night of, right before the attack on early in the morning on October 7th in Israel. And so there's a lot that is implied by that. And I believe that Halevi would have been at that meeting and maybe even might have been heading it up. And so to have 4 Sayeret Matkal veterans surrounding this operation, I would say 2 of them in place in terms of the operation side of it. That's obviously the Crime Minister Netanyahu. He is de facto responsible for the intelligence failures, TM, and the security breakdowns, Inc., that we've come to understand as part of an MO whenever you're dealing with something like Israeli intelligence operations. And then you have these 2 media people, Ehud Barak. He's on the media a lot. He even spoke with Aaron David Miller. He went on MSNBC, I think, with Ari Melber.
Yes.
And then
presented as like the responsible, quote unquote, liberal Zionist voice in response to like the right wingers and all that. It's kind of how he was presented. I think, it was the way he presented it. Ari Melber was, we disagreed and Netanyahu was wrong about a lot of things, but it's a time of war and we come together in a time of war. So.
Right. And that's the core piece that makes me think that this is a plot of some sort. That's some of it, because Barak and Netanyahu are overtly political opponents. They were even back after 9/11. It really, I mean, it's become exaggerated, especially since the judicial reform operation by Netanyahu that got so much pushback. But when it comes down to a moment like this, and everyone recognizes that there was a problem with Israeli security, and you really have like upwards of 80 to 90% of the Israeli public against Netanyahu at this point. So it's actually a very interesting, almost a flip. It's an inversion of 9/11 to some extent, where we had a very unpopular president. Now, Netanyahu was already very unpopular, but what we saw after 9/11 in the United States was a very unpopular president go up to something like over 90% support in the moment of people coming together. And of course, there were these questions about intelligence failures and security stand downs or breakdowns after 9/11. But those very much got also pushed aside to rally around a quote unquote response, to the point of where we only had 1 member of Congress to vote against authorization for Bush to respond with a war of some sort. And of course, Netanyahu, one of the first things he did after the 10/7 attack was activate full state war powers for the first time, actually, in 50 years, since the Yom Kippur War, I believe. And so that is a very big indicator, I think, of that this is something like a 9/11. And the other thing that's a big indicator is that Netanyahu is pushing, because this inverted public response of the Israeli public to this, where he went from being unpopular but supported by his own base to now even losing, it looks like, his own base, where there is a general, beyond a supermajority, almost to a consensus in Israeli society that after this war, Netanyahu must go. But he's still in power for this war, which, if we're correct about the or origins of this war, and that it's much closer to Netanyahu's office itself, then there is that combined with this political pressure incentivizes Netanyahu to try to flee forward and extend the war, even, I would say, probably try to expand the war, and then ultimately accomplish both domestically saving himself from his own corruption scandals and indictments, but then also pursuing what has been a long-term plan by most to all of these elements in the Israeli security state to try to finish off the remnant of the original 1948 ethnic cleansing operation under cover of war and terror. And of course, that's where the supermajority of Palestinians living in Gaza are either the people, or in to all cases, basically the descendants of the Palestinians who were terrorized and under cover of war moved out of southern Israel. Actually, right around the areas, in many cases, where the rave was happening, and where it's focused on as the sort of the big, it's also the twin towers of the Israeli 9/11 attack. And we won't go deep into it, but if you just consider that, you go into this rave, it's a psy-trance rave, psychological trance, supernova, the name of the organization, I think. And it was organized by twin brothers who both ended up found dead, murdered at the rave site, which was just a few days before the site was changed. All right, so that's that area right there. So the danger of Netanyahu trying to flee forward here is very significant, because I did notice that what you seem to see, even amongst like the real liberal to leftist Israelis, like what's his name, the guy who was on Democracy Now!, the old school Israeli journalist. Greg, do you remember who I'm talking about?
I do, but his name's escaping me. Haaretz. Levy. Gideon Levy?
Gideon Levy.
Yes.
Thank you, Greg, in your iron trap mind. That's not Zionist terminology, but you do have an iron grip mind for some of these facts and names. That even Halevi, who's really he can be a major critic, not only of Israel, but of Zionism, really, in terms of the way that it has gone down, to even someone like Yuval Harari. They seem to say, yes, Netanyahu's gotta go. There's too many divisions in Israeli society, but it's very interesting. The talking points seem to be, but that will have to be later after this quote unquote response. So that to me seems almost like an adopted talking point, almost a mass consciousness, if not actually a direct talking point that is going on now, because Netanyahu, at the same time as he activated these full-on war powers, also is starting to really apply a police state type of vice grip to the domestic affairs in Israel. Especially, it seems like, to tamp down on potential critical press, of which Israel has a fairly vital domestic press and debate, especially around domestic politics, but also against dissidents, where we're talking like it feels like the Espionage Act on steroids kind of scenario for anybody who in Israel who is putting out information that will degrade the war effort. So this is a major fascist style war move being made right now. So let's just return back to the question of the macro geopolitics of this moment, and Kushner's claim that this wouldn't have happened under a strong President Trump. I'm almost really now starting to believe that the inverse is true, that what they did actually set this up. So let's talk about that. The Abraham Accords and what was called the New Palestine proposal by Kushner, and how it's related to what we covered a lot about Netanyahu doing the rounds after his autobiography came out, talking about how he was going to enact a transcending of the Palestinian question, and that everyone said you couldn't make peace in the Middle East until you solved the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that's proving out not to be true.
I'll say about this that from my vantage point, from our vantage point, I think this is why deep politics continues to matter, and deep core truths continue to matter, all the way from what we call 9/11 to 11/9 and on, because these things continue to matter. And I say they continue to matter more and more as time goes on, because you continue to see so many, the same same bigger network of actors and of interests that are at the center of so many of these things. And from the whole, just the particular point of, well, this wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump was in there, blah blah blah. This is looking at this from even the events that we continue to talk about. The 9/11 to 11/9, even 11/9. Is there this impetus for this sea change in Israel in terms of this move, not only of the political Zionism and all this, but this move actually to the right, like in the center, like right in the central powers of government, if not for the moves that took place in the West geopolitically, and the rise of Trump and the rise of other people globally. This is a part and parcel of all that, and this is I think in a lot of ways a byproduct of this. And as we continue to talk about the twin pillars of the terror war and the culture war, and it all intertwines, and it all, I think, connects to this in a bigger way in terms of the deep political core truths. Like, they still remain in place after an event like this. And obviously that's one of the things that we've that's an important realization, I think, in the aftermath of responding to something like this, is to keep that in mind, that these core truths don't change. And as a matter of fact, they still remain important, and it remains an Achilles heel of so many who have, for whatever reason, failed in terms of attempting to get to the bottom of some of these deep core political truths. And even people who we see as serious truth tellers in some aspects of what we call the 11/9 operation are still unwilling to really go too far in terms of what's needed in terms of a conversation about Israel. And there's some decent geopolitical talk, some of the geopolitics of what might be going on in the aftermath of this, that I think we'll get into as we go on with this little series we're going to be doing about this. But still, when it comes to the core of the specific, of the cores of Zionism, and of this role of this creation of and perpetuating of this global war on terror, and taking it now to this level now in this altered geopolitical reality that we live in over the last number of years continues to be an Achilles heel of so many people. So these deep core political truths don't change, and they become of equal importance. I say even of more importance as time goes on here. And there's some things that are happening that are potential positive steps in terms of some of the winds of political direction in terms of dialogue here in the West. In our country, the United States, particularly, we talk about as Americans, and our central role in terms of events that are going on in the region and geopolitically. But there's still this Achilles heel of so many of not dealing with these deep political realities that are going to have to be dealt with, and that we're going to continue to put at the forefront of analyzing events like this and the implications of as we see it, and the consequences, I think, of this potentially, long-term, short-term, et cetera, not just in the future, but also in the past, that still remain of vital and utmost importance, that we're going to continue to focus on regularly here, because they continue to matter. And the events of, like, the things that Jared Kushner talks about wouldn't happen. No, they've directly, I think, a strong case can be made that they're directly what has led to what has happened, and it remains of importance because of the players involved and of the history. And now in this escalated period of time, we've got so many of the same interests still out there involved, and there's still just not enough people that are filling in important questions and important events in the way that they need to or should be doing. So we're going to continue to do this because it's remains of vital importance, and I stress it becomes more important as time goes on. So that's what I wanted to say about this, that I think is very important, is not to lose sight of these realities.
In backing up what you're saying, I'll just point out that just casting back to 3 weeks ago of what we were focused on in terms of the antidote here, we were focused on Naomi Klein and her book tour that was launched on September 11th, September 12th of this year, and an attack really on deep politics, while also doing some cleanup of weaponized conspiracy theory in a post-COVID era, that someone like Naomi Klein is on the front lines now of the Jewish North American response to Israel's 9/11. And I would say there's some unabashed good aspects about what leaders like Naomi Klein are up to, including alliances with Jewish post-Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, who are helping organize mass protests both in the Congress and outside of the White House, and Klein is a part of that. And then, of course, another voice who's crucial right now in terms of the front lines of explaining what's going on is someone like Max Blumenthal, going on Tim Pool's podcast. And the problems of deep politics and the obfuscation of them is now, I think, only becoming more clearly defined in terms of the danger of that, in terms of these figures like Naomi Klein and Max Blumenthal, who in their own way do some good work in terms of explaining either what some of the deeper situation is in terms of Israel-Palestine in the case of Blumenthal, or in terms of jumping into action to work to create a public push to stop the atrocities against the Palestinian people in Gaza right now on Naomi Klein's side. And then you're also seeing the other thing that we were focused on was what was coming out of this ban the ADL movement, which was very much sprung up out of the alt-right circles on X, Twitter. And then we began to trace it I first, was pointing out to them that they were feeding in politically directly into the mouths of Netanyahu and his conjunction with Elon Musk and other characters. That then got operationalized ultimately with the sit down of Netanyahu and Musk, and then the Spaces sit down hosted by Ben Shapiro with what we call the Neo-Parushim. And now Elon Musk and his platform and Netanyahu as the acting prime minister of this regime at quote unquote war against a captive population where they can just go ahead and turn off water and electricity and stop food and stuff, bomb bakeries, bomb hospitals and all of that. It has full war, quote unquote, war powers. So these figures are now central, I would say, to what's going on right now. By the way, Shapiro hosted that Neo-Parushim sit down with Elon Musk, and now it's been pointed out that a key backer, a key financier really, or advertising financier of the Daily Wire is a company that the CEO is a Duv Devon Special Forces unit veteran. And I'll just point out that there's these two really they have a very long history of being very secret, actually. Sayeret Matkal and the Duv Devon unit. Sayeret Matkal operating behind enemy lines. That means be in an international kind of fashion. But that could be just, in a bordering country. But I would say that I think it's fair to say that behind enemy lines to some of these people like Netanyahu means inside of the U.S. Congress, or to Ehud Barak and on British airwaves is their part of their Sayeret Matkal global tasking of some sort. And the Duv Devon unit, the reason this is very significant, I think, not only is it further proof, I would say, that Shapiro is not just some kind of conservative talking head who got popular, but is likely a long-term, very specific Israeli, likely military intelligence asset, if not a full-on agent. And the fact that one of his major advertising funds backer is a company run by a Duv Devon unit veteran as CEO is very important right now, I think, because what we just saw about the Israeli media warfare operations in conjunction with their kinetic bombing operations reminds me a lot of the assassination of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who's beloved amongst the Palestinian people. She is a Christian woman, and the same thing that happened back then is happening now. And I pulled it up on Twitter X, the Shapiro, along with people like Avi Meyer, who I believe heads up the Jerusalem Post, were saying the exact same things about early Palestinian and press reports about who assassinated or who killed Shireen Abu Akleh that they are saying now in terms of who blew up the Anglican founded and run major Gaza hospital that has become probably the big early moment of Israeli quote unquote war propaganda, where you even have people like Nikki Haley trying to pressure Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib to take down her original post asserting that the Israelis bombed the hospital. And there was a big then controversy afterwards, and the Israelis came in with some really suspect charts about where what they are claiming is a Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfire rocket that hit there came from. And then they came out with this super sketchy, I think totally debunked recording at this point about two members of Hamas talking about this alleged misfire of Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile that struck the hospital's parking lot. And the same groups that were investigating the Shireen Abu Akleh assassination, specifically I'm thinking of forensic architecture, who really nailed down the case and made it unassailable in terms of not Palestinian ricochet or crossfire or a misfire by some random Israeli soldier, but no, the Duvdevan unit, who have a special assassination vehicle, it looks like, used armor-piercing bullet to shoot clearly demarcated Shireen Abu Akleh with a helmet and a press, major press vest on. The way that she practiced, she would always go when the Israeli forces were operating in either refugee camps or areas of the West Bank. She and her crew would always go up to the Israeli military and announce their presence. Everybody knew who she was. She did the same thing that day 2 years ago before she was assassinated. And the Israeli government just continued to release different layers of lies month after month, basically. And many American officials continued to help obscure it, sort of in a similar way that we actually saw Biden, when he came into Israel, say that he'd had his Defense Department had supplied him with intelligence that was fairly convincing that the Israelis didn't do it. And I think we're seeing the same thing this time. So it's very interesting that Shapiro also engaged in attacking people like Tlaib. When are you going to take it down? The American Jewish Committee, or I forget what they're called. They're attacking her. And to me, it looks like it's already now been largely fixed in terms of, yes, the Israelis bombed this hospital. There was a big controversy in the morning as light came that then showed that there was a small pockmark in the parking lot rather than the building directly hit, or a big ground blast that usually comes along with Israeli bombing with bigger bombs that are targeted. Now, it does look like that a small diameter bomb, to me, and this is Boeing has supplied these to Israel, small diameter bomb that can have what's called a JDAM directive kit that is fixed onto a dumb bomb to make it a smart bomb in terms of targeting, that those are then can be equipped to do what's called an airburst, and I've posted screenshots of videos showing the airburst capacity of these kinds of weapons, where they explode right before the ground. And what they do then is they can, if it's in this kind of area, like a hospital, where you have children actually playing in the parking lot, lots of patients and doctors, it will sort of minimize infrastructure damage while maximizing human casualties, which is what it looks like we saw. And this is what I think actually happened. And so I just want to point out that this Duvdevan unit connection to this key media platform, Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro, who we've done some more extensive investigation in terms of his background and his connection with Netanyahu. He was actually in Israel in the weeks before this Simchat Torah treason terror war plot popped off. He was in shul without digital devices and had to be told of it, is what he said, by his security people. He's a crucial voice right now in terms of articulating what I see as like the real id intent of the Crime Minister's government. So I think it's very important to keep an eye on the background and the current machinations of these two crucial Israeli Special Forces units, the Duv Devan unit and Sayarat Matkal, who are unpatched. They, at least at one point, meaning that they were meant to be somewhat covert. And Duv Devan, as opposed to where Sayarat Matkal is going internationally from Israel behind enemy lines, Duv Devan is seen as operating. They have an entire a subunit, I believe, that's focused on blending into local Palestinian populations. All right, and so they seem to be at work in relationship to global media apparatus at this point. The Daily Wire, it was put forth. Shapiro's washed through Breitbart. He played a interesting key role in terms of Paul Manafort's apparently Israeli washing of Russian propaganda during the 11/9 operation and the Trump campaign, and then moves into being bolstered intently on Facebook, and then creates this Daily Wire media outfit out of the background of money from the Wilkes brothers, these sort of messianic Judeo-Christian cultist types from Texas, deeply invested in fracking, who then seem to get an influx of cash for their company from Chinese intelligence front companies. And then that is then solidified into this Daily Wire operation, which is very Jerusalem focused, as we pointed out, in terms of their conference with Jordan Peterson and all of that.
Yep. Important epicenter of terror and culture wars as we continue to talk about with that combination of Breitbart, Made in America, Conceived in Israel, Shapiro's obvious, pretty militant Zionism, I would say, and what we've pointed out about the Daily Wire as being this crucial shaper of like the narrative around the domestic culture wars, or war on culture as we call them, through people like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Candace Owens. It's just some very very vital, important epicenter of things, of information and of information warfare, you might call it. And so it's a very, very important outlet in this regard, and we continue to focus on it for this reason. And it is this epicenter of these varying matters. And obviously, in this moment, and Shapiro is also floated out there as he's one of the respectable ones who isn't too much into Trump and all this. Therefore, he's a little more respectable than his other counterparts. Like, he's still bad, but he's more acceptable of the counterparts. So he's been as bad as he is in a lot of ways. And he does get negative coverage, but he has been sanitized a bit compared to some of his counterparts in, right-wing, quote-unquote, conservative media. And so that makes it to where I think maybe there's a little bit of a guard letting down around somebody like a Shapiro, is obvious to like a more obvious bad domestic actor like a Tucker Carlson, who's actually butted heads a bit with Ben Shapiro over what the reaction to this attack should be. So there's been a sanitizing of Shapiro while his website is really, and the people who work at the Daily Wire with him have been so vital to shaping these domestic narratives around the culture and around all of this. He's been somewhat sanitized, which I think might that there may be some people out there who still don't grasp the danger posed by this operation because of the sanitization to some level or another is like, oh well, he's acceptable. He's not, he's not as into Trump as other people, and he kind of speaks a little more toned down than the really the really out there ones. So that's then Shapiro in a moment like this really gets activated to show, I think, just how ugly and dark he can get rhetorically and otherwise in a particular moment like this one.
Definitely. And I think that we have identified that there is a twin pillar of propaganda points that the Shapiro operation, very likely as a mouthpiece directly out of the Crime Minister's office, but also then I would say this Duv-Devon connection seems to suggest that if Shapiro is really an asset of Israeli intelligence, it's very likely some kind of network of these Israeli military intelligence special forces units of suspended between Netanyahu, Barak, Bennett, Herzl Halevi of Sayeret Matkal, and then the Duv-Devon unit is what Shapiro is operating on behalf of and likely being prepped and pushed in certain directions and briefed very likely. And the twin pillars that he seems to be pushing is one is to the world is the Samson option threat. He was early on in this terror treason, quote unquote, war, very publicly trying to do nuclear extortion against the American government in terms of if Israel gets its back to the wall, then all gloves will come off. That will guarantee a nuclear exchange. And implied behind that, of course, is the much larger Samson option, which was articulated by Israeli military and historian Martin Kreveld, who openly stated that European capital cities were targets, nuclear targets of the Israeli Air Force in a Samson option kind of moment where they had their quote unquote back to the wall. They would bring down the entire structure. So there's that, right? And that's a push to get full backing probably of not only material aid, but also of public support for any and all things that the Crime Minister and his regime seek to do. But then the other side of this that I think that we're seeing from Shapiro is this major push in terms of accusations of anti-Semitism, which is really working its way through the Israel lobby and the ADL and the AJC, who are really now in the middle of what I would say is Jewish American civil war 2.0, which is on steroids. The first one was post 9/11 in terms of the Iraq War, where you had a super majority of the actual Jewish American people against the Iraq War, and you have every single Israel lobby organization and journalistic institution to a one supporting it, including the liberal Zionist alleged, including the liberal Zionist major press players at the time, which would be people like Jeffrey Goldberg, who's in even a more central spot now in terms of the Atlantic, and then someone like Peter Beinart, who was, I think, at the helm of the New Republic at the time and pushed the Iraq War. Now Peter Beinart is now said to be front and center for the resistance of some sort. But I'm very skeptical in terms of the hangout of what Beinart is putting forward. Okay, we're going to leave it there for now, as we're having some audio technical issues on Greg's end right now, and we will come back to this in a part 2. But I just want to finish pointing out that there are some real basic questions in terms of the security breakdowns and the intelligence failures that should be looked into. For example, both Shin Bet, which is the internal security services, which would lead the way in many ways to begin to assess a potential security threat in Israel. They have undercover groups. I think one of them is called Yaman. And then Amman, which is the Israeli military intelligence group, they also have sources and methods and networks in or about Hamas and Gaza. Now, you layer on top of that the warnings that are now notorious coming out of Egyptian intelligence, the direct days before coming out of actual Israeli military officials warning of something coming. And then even U.S. intelligence has said that there was some intelligence before this. Then you add on this, remember, this is the smart country extraordinaire in terms of high technology. The startup country, right? The startup nation. They obviously have Unit 8200, signals intercepts and analysis aspects. Now, a lot of this has been attempted to be explained away in terms of Hamas operatives getting very analog and old school in terms of communications and preparation for that. And some of that may or may not be true. That is likely true. But this kind of operation has been admitted to have been planned and worked on for more than a year, basically since at least the last go around with Netanyahu. And a lot of it, basically all of it in terms of the major training, is happening in Gaza, and some of it is out in the open. And so then you're dealing with the Unit 9900, which is the geospatial analysis group, which, by the way, remember this background of Max Blumenthal coming through Real News Network. And we did a background analysis of where Real News came from. And one of the co-founders was a man named Rabbi David Ostreicher, who had set up some kind of institutional investment structure to help autistic Israeli kids be part of Unit 9900, which is basically assessing geospatial intelligence. That would be things like live or updated mapping of what's happening on the ground in Gaza, for example. Right. Then you had on top of that these massive long delays of the Israeli air response and the ground response. And I think it's becoming obvious that this was at the very least something like 9/11, where there was at the very least some kind of operation that was known about and prima facie allowed to happen. And then it is possible that things got out of hand, but if they got out of hand, then they got out of hand because of a very likely stand down in many ways. And so there may be an even deeper analysis here in terms of, we know about counter gangs and the whole long history of Hamas and the Likud, especially, as Hamas set up as a counter gang, both geographically to the West Bank and the PLO, Palestinian Authority, Fatah, to Gaza, Hamas, but also politically to divide and conquer, as is being well reported in the Israeli press, as Netanyahu says, if you want to prevent a two-state solution, then we have to continue supporting Hamas. Now, that could go very deep. We know the idea of agents in place and all of that. We then have this question of Hamas and going to Russia in the last 6 months. There's a lot going on here in terms of how deep this aspect goes. But just the surface level in terms of these intelligence failures and security breakdowns are already heading to an actual Israel's 9/11, a Simchat, Torah, treason, terror war plot. And so we will get further into this in our future recordings on this. But until next time, I thank you, Greg, for doing this on this Friday night. I thank you all out there rocking with us, for supporting us, for being engaged. And until next time, AnteDote, we are out.